Hello everybody, Jediwarlock here, and welcome back to another video here on the channel. Today, I'm going to be going through and ranking every single region currently available in the Lord of the Rings Online using this handy tier list I made a couple days ago. As you can see, I have my webcam on today, and I'm planning on this being a more chill video, just a casual walk through Middle-earth while I give my thoughts and opinions on each of these different areas. So with that, sit back and relax, go grab a slice of leftover pie, and let's get right into it. Starting off our list today, we have Ered Luin. Now, this zone is located in the far west of Middle-earth against the Blue Mountains, and it is the starting zone for both the Dwarf and Elf races. In the north, you have the Thorin's Hall Quest Hub area, which is for the Dwarves, obviously. And then in the south, you have the more forested grassland area around Kellendim and the like. And so you really get to see some interaction between these two races and kind of as they ally together to face off against the Dourhand dwarves and the goblins of the region, which makes for a pretty interesting starting experience for both of these two races. I like the different environments that are depicted in this region, you might say. You have the kind of snowy slopes in the north, which slowly kind of morphs into the grassland, foresty areas down in the southeast, which I'm really a fan of, having the progression throughout a region, which is kind of cool. I do like the quest line and how it kind of sets up the threat of Angmar kind of building up in the background. And so overall, I think Ered Luin is a pretty good zone. I'm going to put it at a solid A rating. Now moving on, next up we have the Shire. Obviously a very important region in both the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings stories. This is kind of the starting point for the great adventures, as anyone who's seen the book or seen the movies or read the books knows. The quest line or the quests in general in this region aren't my favorite. There's not a whole lot going on, as the Shire is usually a pretty safe place and there's not a whole lot of threats to deal with here. But the region is very, very well designed, and I do appreciate how much time the developers put into making this feel realistic to what Tolkien envisioned. And so aesthetically, I think the Shire is probably one of the greatest zones, and while the quest lines might be a little bit weak, it's definitely a crucial area to have in the game. And so I think I'm going to put the Shire at a low A, right? It's up there, but it's not the greatest zone in the game. Next up, we have one of my personal favorite zones in the game, Breland. Now, this is the starting zone for the humans in Lotro, and what strikes me most apparently about this region is the diversity of the different areas within the region. You have the grassy Bree fields, you have the old forest where Tom Bombadil lives, and you have the Barrow Downs with all of the different tombs and kind of spooky areas, which is kind of cool. Breland is a great introduction to the threat of Angmar kind of coming down from the north and starting to kind of hold some sway over the events of the region. You get to team up with some of the rangers who are tasked with protecting Breland and kind of dealing with some of the threats as they emerge, which is pretty cool. It sets up the baseline for the rest of the Shadows of Angmar story, and it really does a great job of introducing you to a lot of the systems and the way things work in Lotro, basically. This is definitely one of my favorite zones. I'm going to have to put it at an S rating. It is one of my personal all-time faves. My main, of course, is a human, Farstrike. And so I spent a lot of time in Breland, and it's honestly just a great zone overall. Next up, we have the Lone Lands. Now, Lone Lands is probably the first non-starting zone area that many players will venture into. The ambience of this region is awesome. It really contrasts with all of the different starting zones. It's desolate, it feels uninhabited, or if it is inhabited, it's inhabited with enemies, which is kind of a big change from some of the starting areas, which feel, a little bit more safe and secure, to say the least. Orcs and goblins are very common in the Lone Lands, and Weathertop is also here, which is a cool little tie-in to the story, I guess you could say. Speaking of the story, the quest line that you go through in the Lone Lands is probably one of my all-time favorites. It's something of a secondary quest line compared to what you see and hear about in the books and movies. It involves you going around and helping Radagast the Brown kind of deal with some of these Angmar threats that weren't mentioned or really talked about in some of the more established Tolkien lore. And so it's kind of cool to go through and experience that kind of behind-the-scenes story and try and take back the Lone Lands from all of these invading forces. Lone Lands, by far, also one of my favorite zones. I'm going to put it in S tier, right behind Breland. Moving on here, we have the North Downs. Now, the North Downs is located, not surprisingly, to the north of Breland, and it's probably one of the first regions that new players will spend their Latro points on to unlock, and it's honestly also one of my favorite zones. There's three, right, that are going to get the S tier here in this case. The North Downs does such a good job of expanding upon the story of Angmar's influence. It brings in a lot of new elements to the game. You have probably one of your first big factions, the Rangers of Estildene, that you're going to be interacting with and doing quests for, etc. The story is great. You have the orcs attacking Trestle Bridge, and you're trying to keep the location of the hidden ranger base of Estildene a secret. And you're kind of going through and dealing with all of these other threats. Not to mention you have the gigantic Fornost Castle in the northernmost part of the region, which is kind of spooky and has its own whole set of lore. Overall, the North Downs just has a lot good going for it, and I don't know where else to put it other than S. It's a great zone. Now moving on to Evendim. Evendim is an example of the developers kind of taking a risk and really benefiting from it. The large portion of the zone is actually taken up by Lake Evendim itself, which to a certain extent makes traveling across the zone tedious and sometimes difficult if you're, having to swim halfway across the region to get somewhere. But there are ways around that, and not to mention the big city of Anuminas, which is being overrun by Angmar and plundered for its treasure, etc. So you're working with some of the Dunedain Rangers of the North to put a stop to those plans and deal with some of the other threats to the region, such as treasure hunters, who are trying to rob the tombs of all of the ancient Arnorian kings, as it were. Evendim, I personally like a lot. I know the lake can be something of an annoyance, but overall I'm going to put it in A tier because I think it adds a lot to the continent of Eriador, and without it, it would just kind of feel incomplete. Next up, we have the Trollshaws. Now, the Trollshaws is a forested region to the east of the Lone Lands. This is where the hidden valley of Rivendell is located, which is pretty cool, I will admit. Rivendell is one of my favorite locations in all of Latro. But the zone itself as a whole really doesn't do it for me. There are a lot of different, valleys and canyons that you have to navigate, and I wasn't too thrilled with the questing in this region. I went through and did it just a couple of years ago, I believe, and it wasn't anything special compared to something like the Lone Lands or the North Downs. I do think it is a visually distinct region with the pine trees leading into the Rivendell Valley. It's very cool. But overall, it just kind of feels incomplete, and I don't love all aspects of it, especially the navigation. So I'm going to put it in B tier. Now next up we have the Misty Mountains, okay? This, of course, is a very famous mountain range that is featured in both The Hobbit and, to a certain extent, The Lord of the Rings. This is kind of the in-between zone for the Trollshaws, traveling across the mountains to get to areas in Rovanian, like Mirkwood, the Vales of Anduin, etc. There's not a whole lot going in this region. It obviously has a lot of snow, which makes it visually distinct, but I'm not a huge fan of the lack of content and obviously just the immense distances you have to travel through the snow, just kind of vibing. So I'm going to put this in D tier. This is one of my least favorite zones. I haven't gone through all of the quests in this region, but I'm not a huge fan of the way that they decided to implement the content here, so we're going to leave it in D tier. Now next up we have Forakel. Now this is the far northernmost zone of Eriador. You get to meet the Lossoth Snow People, and you get to help them deal with invading Angmar forces who are there for some unknown purpose that you figure out throughout the quest line, which is a pretty cool story, I will admit. Again, it suffers from the same issue as the Misty Mountains, in that there's a lot of just blank snow spaces, not to mention it suffers from the same problem that Evendim has, where you're dealing with this massive ice bay that you have to circumnavigate every time you want to do a quest on the other side of the zone, which is kind of annoying, but it is visually very cool. You know, you get to trudge through the snow, help out these very secluded people, and overall I do like some of the feeling I get when I quest in this zone, but I'm still going to go ahead and put it in C tier because a lot of it's just empty space. Next up, we have the region of Angmar itself. Now, in 2007, this was designed to be the endgame zone. It has the Castle of Karn Doom, where the Witch King himself resides. You're working with the other free peoples of Middle-earth as you kind of go through the zone and eventually invade the castle itself to put an end to the evil that dwells there. I think it was a cool concept, especially when it was first released. However, I wasn't a huge fan of the visuals here. It just kind of feels dim and dark, which it should, of course, but there's not a whole lot of variety, and I think it could have been implemented a little bit better, as some of the areas are kind of hard to navigate, and the quests are interesting, but sometimes they can feel like a slog to get through. So I'm going to put Angmar at a low B. It's basically on par with the Trollshaws. It wasn't my favorite region to go through, especially as I was looking forward to going through Moria, and beyond, of course, but it was interesting to an extent, so I'll put it at a mid-tier B. Next up, we have Eregion. Now, this is a very important zone from a lore perspective. This was where the ancient elf smiths created the elven rings of power, and it was where Sauron actually attacked the elves in the Second Age, so lots of important historical significance to this area. You also have the Walls of Moria, kind of pre-area to the Moria expansion, which I thought was very well done. It was very cool. Other than that, the zone has some mediocre quests. I do like the feel of the zone, and I think overall I'd put it at a low A. Not one of my favorites, but definitely up there, and it was well executed. Next we have Enedwythe. Now, Enedwythe has a wide variety of different kind of sub-areas within the zone, which I think is cool. You're following the story of the Grey Company of Rangers as they venture south to meet up with Aragorn eventually in the story, which is pretty cool. You get to kind of join them on their adventure. You have a kind of secluded colony of hobbit-like people that you get to meet up with and interact with, which I think is kind of cool. And you also have the Thror mountain area. I forget exactly what it's called, but that has to do with some of the dwarf history, as well as you're dealing with dragons and eventually Dunlendings in the south of the zone. So the zone is very vibrant and diverse, and while it's not one of my favorites by any means, it is just a solid kind of intermediate zone. And so it keeps the story going, and for that, I think it deserves an A tier. Next, we have the famous region of Dunland itself. This is where the majority of the Dunlending people reside. You get to interact with the different colonies of Dunlendings, and you get to see how Saruman has had some influence in this region, kind of corrupting certain tribes and making them quarrel amongst each other, which is kind of a cool dynamic for the story. This is also the region where I received my Gondorian Ranger cosmetic outfit, which I've featured many times in my different videos that I've made on Latro. And so that's going to give it a couple extra bonus points, of course. The quests are pretty interesting, especially as I mentioned with the interactions between the different tribes of Dunlendings, and you're trying to mediate some peace, but also deal with the threat of Saruman. I'm going to put Dunland at a mid-tier A. I'll go ahead and put it, I don't know, maybe in between Evendim and Eregion. It's pretty cool. I haven't spent a lot of time here really delving into all the aspects of the area, but from what I do remember of this zone, it was pretty good. Next up, we have the Etten Moors PvP region. This is for max level free people characters, as well as if you've purchased a monster player character, you can go in and fight other players within this zone. I've only tried out a monster character probably once or twice, and so I'm going to say have not explored for this region just because I haven't been to all the little areas and I don't know a whole lot about what goes on there. Next up, we have Frost Bluff. Now, with Christmas time and the holidays just around the corner, I thought I'd include this on our tier list today just because I think it's a cool little area. This is the daily quest hub where you can go through and get a surprising amount of XP for doing all sorts of little winter-related activities. So we obviously have to give Frost Bluff an S tier. It's one of my favorite places to go, especially in December when the holidays are coming up, and I like getting all the XP from the daily quests, of course. So we're going to put that at S, and it honestly should be the best S, of course, because it's the best region, but we're just going to leave it here because it is kind of a meme area to a certain extent. Now next up we have the Gap of Rohan. Okay, this serves as kind of a middle sub-area between Dunland and Isengard leading into the rest of Rohan. So I don't have a lot extra to say about the Gap of Rohan other than it's Dunland Part 2, so I'm going to go ahead and just put that right next to Dunland. Now, Isengard is a very interesting region, okay? This is kind of the conclusion, to some extent, of the Grey Company quest line, where you go and infiltrate Isengard, and you end up getting captured, and you have to serve some time in the dungeons of Isengard, and it's very immersive, and I really like the story in this region. As you know, it's not a gigantic part of the map by any means, but I do like how it incorporates both the Grey Company story as well as the Ent side of the story once they come in and Isengard gets flooded and all of that business happens. And so I think I'm going to put it a little bit higher than Dunland and maybe even Evendim because I did like the story experience and it kind of tied into the beginning of the Rohan story, which I thought was also kind of cool. Next up we have Moria, or Khazad Dûm. Again, I'm going to spoil this a little bit early, but this is one of my favorite areas that the developers have ever made. It's diverse, it has probably 7 or 8 different subzones within it. Even though you don't see the sun, I don't see the sun usually anyway, and so, I fit right in here. And there's so much different diverse texture packs and enemies to fight. I really enjoyed the story of, fighting the Watcher in the Water at the beginning. You go through and explore Moria kind of from the west side to the east side. You go through and help I believe it's the Iron Garrison group of dwarves kind of reclaim parts of the Moria city one at a time as you're moving. And then you get to experience all of these other secondary quest lines that really aren't touched on all that much in the books or movies, which I think is kind of cool. Moria is probably one of the best designed regions. You also get your first legendary weapon in Moria, and you get to level that up, which is kind of a neat addition. And overall, they just executed the whole feel of an underground city so well. And that is why I'm going to put Moria at an S tier. I think mid-S tier. We'll call it good right there. So after you've adventured through all the regions of Moria and you come out the other side at the East Gate, you come into Lothlorien and the Dimrill Dale. Now, aesthetically and visually, I think this zone is probably one of the best ever created. The Lothlorien woods look exactly as you'd imagine them. There's also the Dimrill Dale with the Mirror Lake right outside, which is also very beautiful. And the whole area is so visually complete that it felt like the developers really spent a lot of time making it feel like you were actually in the story, which is cool. Speaking of the story, the quest line in this zone isn't anything super special. You kind of tie back into the Fellowship of the Ring story a bit, but a lot of the other quests outside of the epic story just involve, going around and scouting the perimeter of the forest, which is fine, but there's not a ton of action going on. And so I think I'm going to put Lothlorien at a lowish middle B, I would say. It's definitely visually very cool to explore, but after you do quests in it for so long, it does get a little bit repetitive. Next up, we have South Mirkwood. Now, South Mirkwood, I also think is probably one of my favorite zones. It has a really cool story with you helping I believe it's the Galadriel elves invade Mirkwood and assault the Tower of Dol Guldur, which is pretty cool because you don't really learn about that all that much in the Lord of the Rings books, but it is an important lore event that helps set up the Free Peoples for victory down the road. So I think that's kind of cool that you get to embark on that journey with the elves and kind of travel through the different sub areas of Mirkwood as you work your way towards the castle of Dol Guldur itself. The daily quests I wasn't a huge fan of right before you get to the castle, but luckily at that point I didn't need a whole lot more XP, and so I didn't fully experience all of that, but I think most of the visuals and the quests in this area are very well done, and I'm going to put it at a high A. Put it right here. Next up, we have the Great River. Now, after the Fellowship, of course, gets on the boats at Lothlorien and sails down to Amon Hen, they pass through this area called the Great River region. And really what this serves as is an intermediate between Lothlorien and the area of Rohan. Okay, so lore significance-wise, it doesn't have a ton, considering it's kind of the middle area just between two bigger players in the story, but I do like certain parts of this zone. To an extent, I think the idea of the Stanguard kind of Rohan colony on the very outskirts is kind of cool. You interact with them and you get your first little teasers of what to expect in Rohan, which is kind of cool. Other than that, I don't have a ton to say about this zone. It was cool to explore, but there wasn't anything special about it. So I'm going to go ahead and put it at a high B. Put it right here. Now we're moving on to East Rohan, okay? This includes the Amon Hen area where the climactic battle of Fellowship of the Rings happens. There's, of course, a lot of Rohirrim populations here. You get to meet the different kingdoms or like sub-kingdoms. I don't know exactly what the word is, but you get to go through each of the sub-areas and help out with, the different threats to this area. I do think it is pretty cool that they included I believe it's the Heightbolt quest line, where you get to kind of build your own little Rohan fortress and protect it against enemies, which was kind of a cool concept. You also got your first opportunity to try mounted combat, which at the very beginning was kind of a novel, cool experience, and I do like how they incorporated it into some of the quests when you're dealing with the mounted enemies, etc. I'm going to go ahead and put East Rohan at a B because it's not as cool as West Rohan, but it is pretty cool. So we're going to put it right there. Next up, we have Wildermoor. Now, Wildermoor is kind of this snowy plateau that's up above where East Rohan sits, and it was kind of designed to be its own little sub-expansion, I believe, in between East and West Rohan. You get to go travel up these slopes and kind of discover that Wildermoor is being overtaken by kind of this unnatural winter, and so you get to go through and figure out all of that. And I think it is kind of a cool region that obviously doesn't really get any attention in the canon lore, but I do like what they did and how they kind of integrated it into the broader Rohan storyline. So I'm going to put Wildermoor at a mid-tier A. I do like what they did with it. This is one of the expansions that I bought and went through, and it was kind of a cool little side story in between the East and West Rohan campaigns. Next up, we have West Rohan. Okay, now this is probably one of the coolest zones. You not only have Edoras, the capital of Rohan, you also have Helm's Deep, which is one of the greatest fight scenes in probably any fantasy movie ever. And you're also dealing with the aftermath of, Isengard and a bunch of Uruk-hai kind of invading Rohan and making things difficult for the people who live there. So you get to go through, experience that whole story as we see in the Two Towers, and it's really, really cool. So if you guys are new to Latro and you haven't quite gotten to West Rohan, definitely stick around for that because it is one of the best epic battle sequences I think you'll experience in the game. So we're going to put West Rohan, obviously above East Rohan. I think a pretty high A is in order for this area. Now, after the battle at Helm's Deep, of course, you're kind of done in Rohan, and so you travel through the Paths of the Dead and end up in Western Gondor, okay? Now, lore-wise, of course, this is where Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn went to start fighting using the Army of the Dead, which is pretty cool. So you get to go through and kind of experience this lore and this part of the story. You get to visit the maritime city of Dal Amroth, which is pretty cool, and one of the first big cities you get to see in Gondor, which is a preview of what's coming for sure. But overall, the quests aren't anything too special. I liked how they integrated it with the current established lore, but other than that, you're really just dealing with the threat of the Corsair pirates as they have allied with Sauron, and they're kind of, attacking on two fronts, and so you have to deal with that a little bit. Western Gondor, I'd say it's kind of on par with East Rohan. It's more of a teaser of the really, really cool stuff that comes next, but a B nonetheless. Next up, we have the Dead Marshes. Now, this is actually kind of a subzone that you go to in between Western Gondor and Central Gondor. It's kind of weird how they kind of worked that in with, teleporting to the other side of the map to do some little side quests. I wasn't really thrilled with the way they implemented this, and while it was cool to be able to go through, where Sam and Frodo and Gollum traveled, it's really nothing super significant. It's just a swamp. And so I'm going to go ahead and put that in the C category. After you go through the Dead Marshes, you're back on the Gondor storyline. Obviously, Central Gondor includes the city of Pelargir, which is where Aragorn used the Army of the Dead. There's also a pretty cool instance group encounter, I guess you could say, in this area with the Siege of Pelargir itself. So if you've never done that epic battle, definitely check it out. It's very cool. You're continuing to deal with the threat of the Corsairs, and I think maybe the Haradrim and the Easterlings as well to a certain extent. And so this is really getting into the War for Gondor, kind of epic battles, large-scale invasions, etc., which is pretty cool. It's a cool dynamic for sure. I will rank Central Gondor a little bit higher than Western Gondor, because the story, for one, I think is slightly superior. So we're going to put it at mid-tier A. Now, of course, we have Western and Central Gondor, so of course we have to have Eastern Gondor. Now, this is kind of the South Ithilien area as you're moving towards Minas Tirith. You get to interact with the Rangers of Gondor, and obviously you're still on that southern battlefront, so you're dealing with a lot of the Easterlings and Haradrim as they come up from the south, and you have to fight them. And I believe this area also includes going through pre-battle Osgiliath and pre-battle Minas Tirith, which, apart from making my computer crash every couple of minutes, it is very, very cool. And you can really feel the almost vibe of despair and doom that's kind of come to Gondor. And this isn't even during the battle yet, right? This is the pre-battle Minas Tirith. So it's very, very cool to be a part of that and kind of prepare for the oncoming war of Pelennor Fields, or the Battle of Pelennor Fields, excuse me. And I think it is definitely the best of these three Gondor regions. So we're going to put it at a high to mid-A, I would say, just because Minas Tirith and all of the lore surrounding that is very cool. Moving on to Old Anorien. This is the region of Gondor that's slightly north of Minas Tirith, and I believe this is the part in the story where you go and you help kind of guide the messenger to reach Rohan and to make sure that the Rohirrim are coming. I don't really enjoy how the Caer Andros area or city wasn't really finished. You can kind of go across this bridge and you just get stuck at this gate, and there's not a whole lot to do in this region. It really serves as again, an intermediate zone between Eastern Gondor and Far Anorien, which is next on our list. And so it's kind of just an in-between zone that doesn't have a whole lot going for it. And so I'm going to put it at a low B. probably right next to Great River, since they kind of have the same concept in terms of, purpose within the wider game map. As I mentioned, we have Far Anorian. Now this is the kind of northern bound of where Gondor exists. This is where the Tower Druidan Forest is located, where the Rohirrim have to get through in order to get to the Battle of Pelennor Fields, which is actually kind of a major part of the story if you've read the books, but it wasn't really included in the movies, which I think is a shame because you get to interact with the Wos people and how they, help the Rohirrim get to where they need to go, which is very cool. The area is somewhat hard to navigate, though, especially when you're dealing with the orc camps. I felt like going around there with all of the dark trees was kind of difficult. But I do like the lore and the story and, frankly, the message behind the zone. And so we're going to put this right up here with Eastern Gondor. Next up, we have the region called the March of the King. Now, after the Battle of Pelennor Fields, the March of the King is kind of the placeholder area for the after-battle Minas Tirith, right? So it's after-battle Minas Tirith going across into North Ithilien, where Aragorn literally does his march to where the Black Gate is located as they're trying to draw out Sauron's armies from Mordor. So the March of the King is basically after battle Minas Tirith, and you're moving with Aragorn's army up Ithilien to where Mordor is located. One thing I do really, really like about this zone is how they added in the Heneth Anun area where Faramir takes Frodo and Sam, the hidden pool cave location. I thought that was a really nice addition. And the region is just beautiful as well. I think I have probably too many screenshots of just going through this area as we're going towards Mordor. It's really kind of a cool contrast to see, on the doorstep of the biggest enemy in Middle-earth, you have this vibrant, lush little region of land, which is just pretty cool to explore. So I'm going to put March of the King at mid-tier A. I think it is probably my favorite of all of the Gondor regions, and so we'll put it right here, right below the Shire. And the story, while it's not my favorite by any means, I think it does do a great job of segueing from the aftermath of the battle all the way to, all right, here we are at the edge of the Black Gate, basically. So I think it is deserving of an A-tier spot. Next up, we have the Wastes. Now, the Wastes is kind of the outskirts of the Black Gate itself, and the Black Gate located right in the south of it, obviously. There's not a whole lot to do in terms of general questing in this region. I didn't enjoy, going through the different little slag mounds and fighting enemies. That wasn't my favorite part of the zone. However, this is the location of the Battle of the Black Gate, which is probably one of my favorite instanced epic storyline encounters of the entire game. It's phenomenally well done, and you really get to kind of reunite with the Fellowship here, or part of the Fellowship, and experience this final climactic battle, which I think is awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and put the Wastes probably at a mid to low A. I don't think that the epic storyline can fully make up for the fact that the zone is kind of sparse in some areas, but we're going to go ahead and put it right here. Mid-tier A is where we'll call it. Now, Mordor. This is, of course, the after Sauron's defeat Mordor, and so it's kind of the remnants of Sauron's army that you're dealing with. You're going in with the Free Peoples and kind of cleansing the few last bastions of evil here. I personally have not purchased the Mordor expansion, and so I really have only traveled through here once or twice to get all of the horse travel points, just in case I decide to come back later. So I'm going to put this in the have not explored for now, but I do think it is the coolest of the have not exploreds up to this point. Next up, we have Aren Lasgullen and the Dale Lands. Now, Aren Lasgullen is basically northern Mirkwood, which is where the Elven King's Hall is located. This is where the Magic River is also located, where the company of Thorin Oakenshield passed through, got trapped by the elves, etc. This is also the location of the Lonely Mountain Erebor and the town of Dale and Lake Town. I do think this area is very cool from a lore perspective. I mean, this is probably half of the zone, or half of the zones where The Hobbit takes place, which is very cool. There are a lot of tie-ins to that history, as well as the battle that took place during the Lord of the Rings in Dale and Erebor, which is kind of cool. You're getting to see the aftermath of that and having to deal with the leftover Easterlings in the area, which I think is kind of cool. I did not love navigating through Northern Mirkwood. It was very hard, and I got turned around a lot, and frankly, I was probably a little bit under-geared, to be honest, and so that made things a little bit more difficult. But from a lore perspective, it is very important, and it has quite a few good spots, too. So I'm going to put Aaron Lasgalen in the upper Bs, I would say. It's probably my favorite B tier zone. Next we have Ered Mithrin. Now these are the mountains located above Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, kind of at the far north of Middle Earth. This is where the ancient dwarf holds are located, and so you're kind of tasked with helping some of these dwarves reclaim a couple of these different areas, which is pretty cool. This is also where the Anvil of Winterstith is located. This is one of the big raids that was introduced just a couple years ago, and you kind of get a lot of background lore about the ice dragons of the north and that kind of thing, which is very, very cool. I loved questing in this region. I'm not sure if I can nail down exactly what made me love this region so much, but it was one of my favorites, especially in the upper levels. And so I'm going to put Ered Mithrin at a high A, probably about here. Next up we have the Iron Hills, which is the other part of the Dwarf Hold's expansion or update, I guess you would say. This is to the west of Erebor in the Dale Lands, and this is where, if you remember in The Hobbit, this is where Dane Ironfoot comes from and brings his dwarves in to help at the Battle of the Five Armies. So it's kind of cool to be able to go back here and see it now in the Lord of the Rings time and get to deal with some of the lingering Easterling threats to this zone as well. I didn't like it quite as much as Ered Mithrin, but I think I'm going to put Iron Hills at a low A. It's pretty good. It's pretty good. Next we have Mordor Besieged. Now this is probably, again, one of my favorite all-time zones, especially at the high levels. Mordor Besieged takes place at the end of the Second Age. This is the part in the movies, if you remember, kind of the prologue where all of the armies of the Free Peoples are facing off against Sauron in Mordor, and this is before, the Great Eye of Sauron was constructed, and so it's kind of a backstory almost, and you get teleported back in time non-canonically, right, to kind of take part in these events, and it's very, very cool to meet up with some of these characters that obviously weren't alive during the time of the Lord of the Rings, but they've gone back and kind of retroactively made this story so that you can kind of experience that with your current character, which is really neat. So Mordor Besieged, I think, is an S tier for me. I liked going through and kind of experiencing that final battle between Sauron and the Second Age, the remnants of the Númenórean people, etc. I think it was a very well done zone, and I'm really curious to see where they go with these kind of backstory time travel zones in the future. Next up we have the Morgul Vale. This is the zone where I hit 130. I documented that in a previous video. The Morgul Vale itself wasn't my favorite, but wow, they really overdid, or I guess outdid themselves with making Minas Morgul itself. There's, I think, 5 or 6 different layers you go through. Each of them have their different feel and their different enemies you have to deal with. And it's really just a great zone from a lore perspective, even though from a questing perspective it's not always the best. I will add that the Cirith Ungol and the Shelob's Lair areas are also in this zone, which does give it a couple extra bonus points. I think that part of the story where you're kind of venturing into those passageways and going up the stairs, I think that is probably one of my favorite parts of this zone as well. And not to mention I forget what it's called. I think it's the Turingwath area in the southwest is probably one of the greatest lore additions to the zone as well. This is the secret valley that was concealed for thousands of years during the time of Sauron's rule, and now that it's ended, obviously, you get to go through and kind of encounter all of these ancient enemies, which I thought was a cool little detail that they didn't really need to add because they already had Minas Morgul, but it was a cool addition nonetheless. Morgul Vale, I'm going to put at a mid-tier A. I did like it quite a bit, and even though there were some shortcomings with the back and forth with the questing, and it did get kind of repetitive in a couple quest lines, I did really like the feel of the zone overall. Next up, we have the Vales of Anduin zone, which is kind of a effective amalgamation of a couple different parts of the story. You have the Beornings under attack from some of the Gundabad forces that have kind of taken precedence in terms of enemies since Mordor's defeat. You also have some of the Wood people kind of in the south of Mirkwood, or Middle Mirkwood rather. They're kind of helping out, and you're also helping them defeat some of the remnants of the enemies left behind by Saruman when he was searching for the One Ring for a couple years, which was pretty cool. And another really neat aspect of the story that I think I should mention is Isildur, who had the One Ring at some point and eventually died on the banks of the Anduin. You actually get to go through kind of a really cool story element with him and his ghost, and you're dealing with some of the after effects of all of that, even though the One Ring has been destroyed, which is pretty cool. Aesthetically, the zone is really awesome. It's right on the eastern side of the Misty Mountains, and so you're kind of getting this, runoff from the mountains that's kind of mixing with the forest area of Mirkwood and such. And so I think it's a very cool mix of a few different environments and story elements. And so I'm going to put Vales of Anduin at a middle to high A tier. I think it was probably, not sure, maybe somewhere like right here. A lot of these, though, of course, can be interchanged depending on different, different parameters and etc. And so take these with a grain of salt. I would say the overall tiers are much more important than where I've arranged each of them in the tiers, of course. Next up, we have the Wells of Langflood, which is just to the north of the Vales of Anduin. I think aesthetically, this zone looks very cool. I have not had the chance to go through and experience the story, but visually it was very cool to ride through and explore the different camps and stable points. So we're going to put it in the have not explored, and unfortunately this is actually the last, or rather none of the rest of the regions I have actually explored, so I guess you can tell where these last three are going, but I would like to explain just kind of my thoughts on them in general. Next we have Elder Slade. Now this is the Gates of Gundabad area. This is kind of the mustering ground for the dwarf army as they prepare to invade Gundabad and take it back one last time. There's not a whole lot going on in this region otherwise. It's kind of the preparation for the Gundabad expansion, which actually just launched, and I cannot wait to try out. But for now, I'm going to put this in the have not explored. Next, we have the Blood of Azog map. This is actually the second time travel zone, I guess you could call them, that's been added into the game. This one takes place at the Battle of Azanal Bazaar, I believe during the Second Age, but it could be the Third Age. Actually, yeah, it's the Third Age, I think. And this is basically the final battle between dwarves and orcs on the slopes of the Dimril Dale and Moria, which is very, very cool from a lore perspective. I haven't had the chance to go there and really explore it, but it does sound very interesting, and I'm excited to, go in and experience that kind of past storyline at a later date. Now, lastly, we have Gundabad itself, which just launched a couple of days ago, just November 2021, if you were wondering. And so this is definitely the next region I'm going to be covering on the channel. I'm going to go through, hopefully rank up all the way to the new level cap of 140, and hopefully I'm going to enjoy Gundabad as much as I enjoyed, Moria or any other of my favorite regions. So for now, have not explored, but in the future, I cannot wait to see what the Gundabad underground city area really feels like. So there you have it. We have our tier list finally complete. 6 top zones here. In the S tier, we have Breland, Lone Lands, Moria, the North Downs, Mordor Besieged, and of course the meme pick of Frost Bluff. So this is my definitive list for the time being. These have not explored, hopefully will be explored at some point. Thank you all so much for watching. I really enjoyed going through, just kind of casually talking about my thoughts on each of these zones. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you're new to join the Jedi Order, and comment down below what you think. I'm obviously a casual player compared to many others who have played this game, and so I'm curious to see your guys' take on, my rankings versus your thoughts on a certain zone or zones plural. So leave your comments down below and I'll make sure to look at them. So with that, until next time, peace.